And so if we think about produce, I appreciate that some of you work with livestock or other animal products, but this was just a way to illustrate factors on a farm that you need to be considering when you think about a specific product. And so if we look at factors that have been associated with produce outbreaks specifically, we can look at the fact that irrigation water has been a concern that's come up time and time again. Irrigation water was listed as a contributing factor to the E. coli L157H7 outbreak in spinach in 2006. It was also listed as a contributing factor to the pepper outbreak with salmonella in 2008. And so when we think about water, water is a really great way to spread pathogenic contamination around within an operation. So controlling water and addressing the potential for contamination of irrigation water is very important in a farming operation. Similarly, all of these foodborne pathogens are naturally harbored in the GI tract of most animals. And so we need to think about, if we're using manure in our operations, how do we handle raw manure and compost in a way to prevent cross-contamination. And similarly, we also need to think about livestock as well as wildlife. So if you're a farm that has livestock on it as well as growing produce, that's definitely a situation that you can manage, but you need to recognize that there is an increased risk because you have a source of pathogens on your farm in close proximity to your fields, and your workers may be working with both livestock and produce. And so managing that risk is important. Also, we totally appreciate that farms are not sterile environments, but there have been outbreaks linked to wild contamination through wildlife. There was recently an outbreak in Oregon associated with strawberries, and there was a great deal of deer activity on the farm which contributed to that outbreak. So that was also something to consider. And similarly, domestic animals can also be a source of foodborne pathogens, and there have been examples of domestic animals causing outbreaks in dairy herds. So that's also something to keep in mind. And then also thinking about topography, because you may not have livestock in your operation, but if your operation borders a feedlot or a dairy, thinking about opportunities when it rains for runoff to enter into your fields may be a consideration as well. Additionally, field worker hand contact. Again, people can be a source of foodborne pathogens, and so they need to, again, not handle food when they're sick with symptoms of a foodborne illness. And then hand washing is very important. And finally, produce wash water. Many of you that work with produce want your produce to look very pretty when you go to a farmer's market to display your produce. And so managing your produce wash water in a way to reduce the risk of cross-contamination is also very important. And so key actions for successful food safety on the farm. As Colette mentioned, our Washington State University Good Agricultural Practices team has been doing workshops over the last several years to assist farmers with implementing food safety practices in produce operations. And so she asked me to talk a little bit about key actions for success. And so at this point, I'd like to run another poll, please.
Sure, I'll go ahead and launch that third poll. So what areas of food safety plans do you find most challenging? Getting started, risk assessment, employee education, or documentation? So go ahead and check all that apply. But 25% of people have voted. 50, 70%. 80%, 88%. Let's give it a couple more seconds. If you're still voting, go ahead and wrap up. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share the result. 14% said their challenge is getting started. 50% risk assessment. 36% employee education, and 64% documentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I was really interested to see the results of this poll because I feel like all of these areas can be challenges for producers, and so I was interested to see how that turned out. And so if we think about the steps to take as you're developing your food safety plans, one thing is performing that risk assessment to assess your operations risks, because not every farm is the same, and so each individual farm is going to have different risks, and it's very important for you to understand your risks. And so one of the requirements from a regulatory standpoint is that all food producers are expected to be what we call prudent processors. And if you'd like to look up the definition of a prudent processor, it's listed in the Code of Federal Regulations down here. But my kind of more fun definition of a prudent processor is that prudent processors persistently peruse for pathogen prominence, which is a lot of fun to say. And so basically what it's saying is that you need to know what your product is and what hazards are commonly associated with it. And so it's very important that you be aware of recent outbreaks that have occurred. And so, for example, most cantaloupe packers were probably not thinking about listeria contamination and reducing the potential for listeria in their packing operations until recently. And with that outbreak, now we really need to be thinking about the potential for listeria in our packing environments to a greater extent than we have in the past. Number two, food safety training is very important for individuals in your operation in order to have a successful plan. And so the level of training should be appropriate for the individual's job. So if you have an individual that's in charge of your food safety program, doing activities like this to get education about foodborne pathogens and learning how pathogens can be introduced in a farming environment is very important. But it's also important to include your employees in this food safety plan on a day-to-day basis, because everyone contributes to food safety in the operation. And the more people that you have that with what I call food safety goggles, the more successful your food safety plan will be. So when you start out, most of you probably at some point started out with very little knowledge of food safety, and at that point your food safety goggles aren't really doing anything. But as you learn more about potential sources of contamination and how to manage those potential sources of contamination, I like to think that everyone gets a pair of fancy night vision food safety goggles where you can really think about the sources of bacteria and other microorganisms and how to manage those in your operation. And again, food safety is something that happens every day in your operation, and so it's very important to consider how very subtle changes in your practices could increase your food safety risk. And let's see, I think with that I'll move on to documentation. I think the majority indicated that documentation is the most challenging area of a food safety implementation, and in most cases food safety management plans are not paper-saving operations, and the importance, though, of the records is paramount. If you don't document what you're doing to address food safety in your operation, then as far as a regulator or an auditor is concerned, it didn't happen. And so having accurate records to document your food safety practices is really important, and it is very challenging. And